There are lots of good reasons to go with Sega Saturn instead of Pretendo. We call them games. Sega Saturn has tons of them. Pretendo has just a few. It does beg the question, do you want to play or twiddle your thumbs? Face it, Pretendo, you weren't worth waiting for.
The Sega Saturn is an odd system. It didn't sell well at the time, and therefore is a very expensive system to buy for. One of the most expensive games for the system, Panzer Dragoon Saga, sells for nearly $4,000 due to it not being initially popular and produced only towards the end of the system's lifespan worldwide. Sega had no clue what they were doing with the Saturn, but it makes it one of the most interesting systems ever released. I'm ModemCat, and today we'll be looking at the Sega Saturn. To discuss the Saturn, we must briefly look at the Mega Drive, or Genesis, depending on where you live. After the poor sales of the Sega Master System, or Mark III in Japan, Sega needed something awesome. Initially called the Mark IV, which didn't have as much kick as what they would later call it, Sega released the Mega Drive in Japan in 1988, and it followed in America and Europe in 1989 and 1990 respectively. Sega renamed the Mega Drive to the Genesis when it came over to America, and it didn't really do much of anything outside of the original Sega audience who have been there since the early to mid-80s, but 1 or 2 or 3 years later, depending on where you live, they released the Mega Drive's flagship title, Sonic the Hedgehog. The Mega Drive was already doing pretty well in Europe, but when Sonic released, the Genesis was #1. But after some bad business decisions and some crappy games, soon people were moving over to the Super Nintendo. In 1994, Sega released the console we're talking about today in Japan. It was a decent success with its pack-in title Virtua Fighter and later Virtua Fighter 2. In 1995, the Sega Saturn came over to America in probably the most careless way possible. Sega announced it was available immediately at the first ever E3 for $399, giving retailers absolutely no time to prepare and families absolutely no time to save up for the system. You have that right, instead of waiting a few months and just announcing it at E3, they chose the route of commercial failure. Sega had way too much faith in arcade conversions. What made them great in 1994 was different than what could have made them great in 1995. Which sounds weird, but the video game industry was such a newly popular thing at the time that everything was changing rapidly. People were no longer interested in playing Virtua Fighter 2 in their home, and Sega bet everything on that one game. The failure launch can also be attributed to an issue that rooted all the way back in late 1991. Yuji Naka, or Yuji Naka, however you want to say it, the main programmer of Sonic the Hedgehog, left Sega of Japan because of frustration with the management, but was persuaded to join Sega of America by a longtime friend who worked at the US branch. Yuji Naka effectively left Sega to join Sega. The US branch ended up developing the most anticipated title in the Mega Drive's history, Sonic 2. If the first of something does well, the second of that thing will probably do even better. That was definitely true with Sonic 2, which was definitely turning heads away from Super Mario World and towards, as Sega put it, blast processing.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
This created a disconnect between Sega of Japan and Sega of America, which rooted even further during the development of Sonic 3. Sega of Japan bet all on Virtua Fighter, which was huge there at the time. For Americans, it's pretty hard to think that Virtua Fighter was considered a phenomenon, but it indeed was in 1994. When the Saturn came over to America, they really didn't prepare anything that would appeal to the US market. The one thing Americans definitely wanted more than Virtua Fighter was Sonic and Mario. I don't think a lot of people realize this, but there actually was a Sonic game in development, though it was cancelled in 1997. The Saturn was super hard to develop for, which deterred third-party support, and people fled to the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. Even as a Sega fan, I can admit the Sega Saturn was a cacophony of poor business decisions, lack of good support, lack of good multiplayer, lack of appeal, lack of a Sonic game, and games too artsy and odd for people to really care in 1996. By 1998, Sega discontinued the Saturn and threw out the Dreamcast, a much better and more groundbreaking system. As much as many people don't want to admit, Sega were on the cutting edge of technology with all their systems. The Mega Drive was one of the first ever fully 16-bit consoles, with a 16-bit graphics processor and 16-bit CPU, the latter of which the TurboGrafx 16 lacked. The Sega Saturn had dual CPUs, CD-ROM technology, crazy GPU power, and the ability to play video CDs if you got a special model of the console or got the VCD card. And the Dreamcast might as well have been the first 128-bit console, with larger CDs and online support. The Dreamcast is arguably even more powerful than the PlayStation 2. But let's not get off track. Wait, go back 51 words. Video CD? Video CDs may have been a short-lived fad in the US that most people don't know about and didn't know about at the time, but in Japan they were pretty big for a while. And the Sega Saturn was one of the first ever major game systems to support the format. So yes, you could watch movies on your Sega Saturn. And still can, in fact. Even if you live in the US, there's a chance you own a video CD, and the card is only about $50. So there's not really a point in owning it if you already have something that can play DVDs and Blu-rays. It is a niche collector's item though. Now let's get on to a new part of the series on old consoles, the variations. And the Saturn certainly had a lot of them. The initial release of the Saturn in Japan featured a gray design with blue buttons and some black plastic surrounding those blue buttons. This is the Japanese Model 1. There were a few different variations on this one, but honestly, if you really like to hear about all of them, I'd suggest checking out Sega Lord X's video on the topic. When the Saturn came west, it was redesigned black with nearly the same internals. Honestly, I prefer the black design to the gray. It seems a lot sleeker and just overall nicer. But I do think when most people think of a Saturn, the gray version comes to mind. It's certainly more iconic and unique. When the Saturn came over, not only the cosmetic design changed, but also the logo and boxes. The US and Europe long boxes are kinda ugly, in my opinion. I much prefer the jewel cases that Japan got, though the logo in America and Europe is undeniably cooler. Now we move to the Model 2. In Japan, we got a white model with gray and pink buttons, and guys, I have to say I love this one. You may notice I actually have footage of this one, and well, that's because I own it. These are definitely the easiest ones to obtain, running about $70 to $95 on the used market. Keep in mind, with all the Japanese models, you will have to mod chip or use an action replay cartridge to play North American games. And if you're in PAL territories, you'll have to use a step-down converter, I believe. Though there is a problem with the white model, and that should be pretty apparent if you know anything about retro consoles. It yellows like crazy, which sucks. It really ruins the crisp look of this design completely. When it came over to America, they did the same black design as last time, and again, it's basically the same as the Japanese version, though it is indeed NTSC-U instead of NTSC-J. The European version is essentially the same though, with gray buttons, and I may have found my least favorite thing. Cool. But the Saturn in the end just couldn't compete with the PlayStation and even the Nintendo 64, at least in America. In Japan, the system did far better, competing with the Nintendo 64 even, which was also a commercial failure over there. But it was absolutely demolished by the release of a single game on the PlayStation, Final Fantasy VII. But due to the Saturn not really being experienced by a lot of people, and being nearly impossible to emulate, I would say this system is absolutely worth buying in 2022. Or 2023 for that matter. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.